join us tonight. And I am delighted that tonight we welcome our very first return guest, Zhen Goh. Zhen is a senior consultant with Cognitive Edge. She is an expert on the Cynefin framework and on complexity theory in general. And tonight, we're going to ask her some questions about, specifically on my end, about the confused domain, because I am, in fact, a little confused. So, Zhen, anything you want to add to my introduction?
Oh, thanks, Barbara. It's again, thanks for inviting me back. So nice to know that I didn't mess up the first time. But it's just want to remove the weight of expert from how you introduced me. I am a curious seeker to understand, and I'm looking forward to hearing how everyone else is sort of processing, understanding this new introduction of the curious domain, not curious domain, sorry, confused domain. Please pardon me. It's 6:11. I haven't had my coffee. Confused domain could also be curious now that I think about it. And to actually invite some discussion. When we were preparing for the session, Barbara emailed me. She said, "How would you like to run the session?" And I thought about it. Should I give an introduction? Should I give some kind of a presentation? And then she suggested that she and Jocko interview me, which I immediately went, yes, that sounds great, because you know what your group wants to hear or not hear, and then we'll take it from there. So thanks for the introduction. Thanks for I see a lot of, again, friends, colleagues showing up. Thank you. Would like to also invite them to be a part of the conversation. And I'm looking forward to your very tough questions.
Yeah. Well, Jocko, do you want to start, or is he even there? Oh, there he is. Okay. Jocko, do you want to start, or should I kick it off with my question?
You can kick it off. I'm still monitoring people admitting and stuff, so take her away.
Okay. And he's also formulating his questions. So Zhen, the thing I'd like to ask you about first is, can you give us a little background on like the evolution of the framework recently, right? Because we, some of us grew up with the domains, and then they changed, and then there was some liminality introduced there. So if you could give us a little background on this evolution of the framework over the last couple of years, we'd really appreciate it.
Absolutely. I think I'll start with the easy part first, which is the renaming of the domains. So for those of you who have been following Cynefin for a while, you know that Cynefin has gone through multiple iterations, which we also cover in our book very nicely by our artist in residence, Sue. She actually went and did the research over time, how it evolved. The latest iteration, actually, the naming came from a conversation, and Michael was there in the room when this conversation was taking place. So the co-author of the HBR article, Mary Boone, that Dave co-authored that leadership decision-making framework piece with, she was in Boston with us. Gosh, was it 2 years ago? 3 years ago now? My goodness. And we were actually there for another reason, which we shall not talk about, but Mary came in by train. She lives nearby. And then we were talking about these books that Dave and Mary are currently co-authoring. And she said, I've always wanted to have 5 Cs because it makes sense, right? And if we think about the domain names before, they were all mostly Cs, with the exception of what was simple became obvious, now clear, and unordered in the middle. So we had a conversation around that, and we agreed actually 5 Cs make sense. And also, clear was one of the ways that people had been explaining the obvious domain, because some people had said, we use this term obvious, but it's sometimes not obvious to people. And then that domain can become a little bit alienating in terms of the way it's named.
Want to hold the key?
Okay, we'd ask everyone to mute themselves while Zhen is speaking.
Oh, it's fine. There's Kate, which is good to know. Yeah, and that was why we started to rename the domains. And again, uh, I used to really like unorder because one of the ways I like to introduce people to Cynefin was to talk about the right side having, order, linear causality, the left side having unorder, and then the middle having sort of disorder, right? So I liked it. We had a bit of back and forth about it, and we thought, oh, let's just go with 5Cs, right? So that's the renaming piece, and it also came together. It made sense. It's buzzy, and we also got Dave to agree that this is the final renaming. We're not going to change it again because we're committing to posting all these things. We're releasing publications, so that was nice. Oh. Oh, whose birthday is it?
Did you hear it click?
Oh,
Did you hear it click, Frank?
No. That's another picture you took.
There's the numbers. What are those numbers saying? I can't see.
There are a lot of numbers.
I can't see.
Hi,
You want to wait?
Are you guys here
Yeah, let's
for
wait for the.
No, Frank, it don't go that way. It usually goes 1, 2.
Thank you, Jocko.
yeah.
I don't know if they're in the wrong meetup or what, but they're sure entertaining.
Only for you, Jen. Only for you.
I know. This is so much fun. I haven't been to New York in a while, so thank you for the New York, sort of essence on this call. So, then, oh gosh, where was I? My train of thought is lost.
We were talking about the renaming, and that this is sort of the final renaming,
right.
and that
Yes.
Dave agreed, which congrats.
I know. But so in this concept of the liminal domain, that had been an introduction that Dave had been toying with for some time, and we agreed that it should be sort of like a standard part of how we talk about Cynefin because of this concept of phase changes, right? And phase changes between domains, which was really critical, and they wanted to actually introduce. So the liminal became a part of it, and we actually thought, no, this was in 2019, St. David's Day post series. And as for those of you who followed Dave for a while, you know that every St. David's Day in April, he actually revisits the framework. He talks about the evolution over the past years. So in 2019, he introduced liminal formally through the St. David's Day post series. And then in...
I don't know what's going on. I mean, I feel like we're on some kind of weird nursing home Zoom bomb list here. I don't know what's going on. I'm sorry, Jen, continue.
It's all right. It's all good fun. This is why you wake up at 6 a.m., Anyway, for those of you who are here to talk about Cynefin,
I'm getting quicker on the triggers, so this is the first time I've had to remove people, so I'll hop on them quick. So sorry about that.
It's the "Are you confused?" title. Everyone's confused now, so it's like, oh yes, this is me. But yes, and then in 2019, Dave introduced it formally as a part of the St. David's Day post series, and then in 2020, actually in between 2019 and 2020, we have a colleague in Stellenbosch, South Africa, that we interact with and talk to quite frequently. His name is Jean van Breda. And he emails us very constantly with papers, research that he's doing, questions that he has. And then he emailed us one day and he said, "Are you talking about Aporia when you're talking about confused? Is that what it is?" And Dave said, "Yes, that's exactly what it is." A light bulb went off for him. he started to put it into the Cynefin sort of domains. And then we had a conversation, which is, what is the difference between being confused and being in Aporia, right? And that's where we said, it's being aware that you're confused, right? It's that and many times we continue business as usual. I mean, now that we're all on the Zoom call, living through COVID times is a really good example of that. When it started, there was still a lot of uncertainty about what we should or should not do. Some countries were, of course, a lot more reactionary than others, Singapore being one of them. That's because we had the memory, right, in recent history of having gone through SARS. Africa, like as a continent, everyone was so worried about the continent, but because in their recent memory, they had the experience of going through Ebola. So actually they had a lot of the response mechanisms in place that it was easy for them to just activate them. There was some muscle memory with it. So they were aware that we're entering a space that we might not be, completely cognizant of what the outcomes are, what the causality is. It's better to be safe. And arguably it might have been an overreaction, but of course, you never know that. You can only sort of play a game going forward, guessing what you need to do. A lot of countries were a bit more reactionary and kicked into gear. So there was an awareness, that we're confused. We might not know everything. And also perhaps a little bit of a hangover of the situations that they had gone through recently, right? And if you look at those countries that had more of a reactionary mechanism, they did fare better than countries that weren't, right? They didn't activate those. There was that almost shallow dive into chaos. So that's where we looked at the two together, this concept of Aporia being, confused. And initially it was just AC. And then we looked at the liminal domain and that introduction. We realized that it cut really nicely through confused, and that made a really nice distinction. So Aporia is the part that sits closer to complex, and confused is the part that sits actually on the border of the ordered domain, which could quite easily tip over into chaos. So for us, that made a lot of sense, putting those two together. And I think for Dave, it resolved for him something that he had been questioning. He said there was something about the framework that still didn't feel complete, right? Particularly because confused over the years has become increasingly important as a domain in my thinking, because so many things actually, to my experience, should begin there. For those of you who've gone through a 4 points contextualization exercise, right? One of my little variations now when I do it is, instead of getting people immediately to determine what your anchor points are in the 4 other domains, is, hey, pile everything in the middle. Because what you're going to find with those 4 anchor domains is in the method, when we discuss it, it's almost like magnets, right? They become pools that you actually balance the other post-its with. And what I found is, because those 4 anchors go on first, they create an attractor, and people tend to avoid the middle, right? There is this discomfort with placing things in the middle. So if you start with the middle, say place everything in the middle, and then work your way out. And then after that balance, right, it actually creates difference, because people are not starting with this categorization frame of mind. So I think for us, it just came together. It made a lot of sense. Just that was a very long introduction, Barbara. I'm so sorry.
No, you answered like my next 5 questions. It was awesome. I thought, I'll go through this step by step. You got it all in one go. Congratulations. No, that was really great. I mean, it cleared up a lot of, questions that I had about this. But since you touched on liminality, I mean, we've talked about it a little bit in some of these things, but if you could go into the concept of liminality a little bit within the framework, we'd really appreciate that, I think.
Okay, so liminality is an interesting one, because if you look at the way that liminality is drawn onto the framework, if you recall, the top between complex and complicated, that loop is open, And then at the bottom, when it has that shallow dip into chaos, through what is now confused aporia, right? That's actually a closed sort of loop. And when we were thinking through it, and when Dave was developing it, I think he went through a few iterations of how to draw that line, because that line actually helps, particularly for those of you who are working with the dynamics of Cynefin, right? We have all these dynamics, like the one that Dave calls the explore-exploit dynamic, that actually goes between complex, complicated. So that's a good one. That's something that is, I think, quite consistently used in a lot of organizations now to understand what have we stabilized that we can exploit, what do we need to continue exploring. But there is another one, which was also the innovation dynamic, where, you know, things might be sitting in complicated, but you might need to periodically pull it into complex. And the way to do that actually is to do it through what used to be disorder, now confused. Because the reason why we say that, and again, with this introduction of Aporia, it made sense, because when you want to pull something into to actually experiment with it, right? Because it's already stabilized, sometimes it's very difficult to disrupt, right? Disrupting an established pattern is not an easy thing, and there's a high energy gradient on that. So sometimes it's easier to pull it into confused, to say, okay, you know, we need to pull this apart. Part of that post that I did that followed up on Dave's introduction of Aporia is a post where I talked about Derrida. And Derrida is quite a well-known deconstructivist, and a lot of his work lies in deconstructing, you know, concepts. And he did this specifically in the area of ethics, right? How do you actually know you're making an ethical decision? You have to deconstruct the way you actually made the decision. So that concept of deconstruction in Aporia, I think it's really resounding when you want to pull something into that innovation curve. So pulling it in, recognizing that we need to deconstruct, potentially moving into a slight dip into chaos, really pulling all the parts, pulling all the things apart, and then going back into complex to actually more innovatively reassemble. So the radical repurposing, for example, things like that, and then pulling it into complicated again. But the thing is, there's always this urge for people, particularly in organizations, right, who are seeking to exploit, to stabilize, to scale, to want to pull things into complicated as soon as possible. But when that liminal line was drawn, it was like, oh, this actually makes sense, because that's exactly the innovation dynamic, the grazing of the chaos, and you know, pulling it back into complex, and then pulling it over and over again and again. So the reason why that top is open between complex and complicated is because we need it to be open. We need it to be permeable. And that line that goes into chaos is closed because we need it to be closed. We can't actually pull things into chaos if we can't actually pull it back up into complex. So the lines were quite deliberately drawn.
Thanks, Jen. And I, in the chat, I've dropped a link to the 2020 St. David, the first St. David's Day post of 2020. I think there's a series of 5, is it, Michael? 8? I can't quite remember how many there were altogether. But you know, that's the post where he begins to break out Aporia and confused and things like that. So, Jocko, are you done with the housekeeping? Do you have a question for Jen?
Barbara, did you put that into chat for everyone? I'm just
I thought I did.
No, it was
No, I did. I sent it right to Jocko. Look at me, unable to run anything here. There we go. Because I was sending Jocko messages about how annoying he was. So.
I get them all day long. No, I'd like to open it up to the group, actually. If anybody has anything based on the wonderful clarity that Zhen has provided to us. Does anybody have any questions or to fight with her?
Jocko, we want her to come back again.
She already did once. She's already run through this game before.
I know, but you know,
this was so much fun.
Okay, so Bao, would you like to unmute yourself and ask Zhen your
Yes.
question?
Yes, happy to do so. Hi, Shen.
Hi.
Could you say something about the complex domain where suddenly the word exaptive showed up, and then it was at one point it was the only word, and then I saw on the video he had now exaptive/emergent, and could you maybe comment on that or speak to that?
I have a lot of colleagues here with grins on their faces because so when it started, I think with Cynefin, when the complex domain was sort of described and all of the heuristics, the words associated with the domain were sort of introduced, it used to be emergent, right? Originally, it was emergent. And then Dave got very enamored with this concept of exaptation. And he said, oh, actually the complex domain is exaptive. There's radical repurposing, it's purely exaptive. And so there are several colleagues on this call that I know, and please chime in, we didn't agree with that. Right? Because it can be exaptive, but it's not purely exaptive. In that space, there is still emergence. It doesn't mean that it has to be, combining parts or radically repurposing parts. It could just be novel emergence, but not novelty, 100% novelty, the way that exaptation implies. And also, there is... to my mind, if you think about the concept of exaptation, there is this, so for those of you who might not be familiar with it, right, Dave likes to use this example of how, so we all know that the ancestors of birds are dinosaurs, right? So when we look at the history, the biological, genealogical tracings, we know that the ancient ancestors of birds were dinosaurs. And one of the things that when they were doing the research, right, these archaeologists said that dinosaurs did not start with wings and feathers the way birds do. The reason why they have wings and feathers the way that birds do right now is because we all know that there was the ice age, right? The world got colder, and they started to develop feathers for warmth because it was a survival technique, and also for sexual display, right? So birds still continue to use their feathers to actually attract a mate. And they said one day a bird falls off a cliff and starts flapping. And that's when it realizes, oh, I can actually use these wings and feathers for flight. Evolution didn't take place in a linear way. So there were these points of exaptation where things that developed for one use were radically repurposed for another. So in modern day, sort of examples are again with COVID are so common now. The most, I think, popular one is that face mask. When they were looking for ventilators and they ran out of ventilators and they used this scuba mask. I'm ashamed to say I actually have one. I use it to go swimming, but that bubble mask with that one respirator that goes up, and they repurposed that for hospital respirators because they were in desperate need. So some of the arguments are that in times of starvation, in times of extreme need, there is a shift in perspective, there is a time crunch, any type of resource crunch, you start to think exaptively. So you see the world in different ways. There's actually a really nice so I'm an anthropologist by training. So if you actually look at archaeological anthropology, they'll actually tell you that there are two things that they look for when they actually go digging to understand if there was a human sort of population, a human society that was there. The first of which is actually a system of meaning, or something that imbued a system of meaning. So this could be cave paintings. This could be the finding evidence of ochre, which was the first thing that they used to color things like, shells and things like that to to form the first form of currency, right? If you think about it, money, currency is nothing but layers and layers of systems of meaning imbued into it. So that's one. And the second one is actually the existence of composite tools, because any ape can use a rock and crack open a coconut, for example, to get the water or the meat out, right? Especially if they've observed it several times. However, they say that human beings are the only ones capable of building composite tools. So that is, for example, an axe, right? So picking up a long piece of wood, saying this piece of animal bone, if I carve it down this way, and then I use this piece of sinew and I tie it together, right? I can make an axe. And that's a composite tool. That's actually an exaptive moment. If you think about language, the way we piece things together across with layers of meaning, how we develop syntax, semantics, for example, that's actually a coming together of this systems of meaning, as well as our ability to think compositely. And that's sort of the foundations of acceptation, right? So in our arguments with Dave, we said, if we take acceptation in that form, in that pure form, the complex domain is not necessarily just exaptive, because there are also points where you're just, one of the metaphors we use is feeling your way through a mist, right? Or driving through a really, really misty day. You go a bit slow and the road emerges as you go forward. Like, there are parts of working through the complex domain that are like that. It's not necessarily exaptive in nature in the purest way. So for a period of time, Dave was using exaptive only in the complex domain. And I would also like to invite some of the colleagues here who have had similar arguments. And I know, Bao, you had arguments with Dave about this as well, where we said it's not purely exaptive. Emergence still holds. It doesn't have to be novel, completely novel in the way that he's assuming that it will be. So that's why in the current iteration, both are there.
I just want to add, Jen, one of the ways I look at it is when we call it exaptive practice, it's actually gives you a bit more, at least from my perspective, of insight of what to do. Right? The fact that we acknowledge that practice emerges doesn't actually give us a practice, if you know what I mean. But if we say you actually put to action exaptive practices, or you try to manage the context so exaptive moments are much more highly probable, it actually gives you something that you can do. If I go into complicated, you apply good practices, which now gives me some latitude. So if I'm working in some industry, right, I can vary the practices within constraints of the ordered aspect of that environment. And in clear, you can apply best practices. And if there isn't one best, you just make a trade-off and make a decision. So the way I kind of look at it, I like emergent practices, but when I thought about it more deeply, when Dave was asserting the exaptive practices, it actually gives a bit more direction for people on what they do.
Yeah, thanks for that, Michael. That's a nice perspective on it. Yeah. I mean, one of the things that attracted me to Cynefin in the first place was that all of you seem to argue all the time, which I find very refreshing. But Bao, perhaps you'd like to tell us about your argument with Dave.
No, I never really had an argument with Dave on this. I was just, I was wondering why at one point it just was exaptive, and then in the video on the website, now it's both. So I wondered what that precipitated, but the story makes sense. I mean, this framework is alive, right? And that's one of the nice things about it. It's not fixed. So it's good to hear that. And thank you. And I really learned from Michael's addition also that, of course, it does give a little bit of a direction. So in the complex domain, of course, you can look what is emerging because you really don't have much control. But in your dealing with it, to try to navigate or to nudge, if you know that you can apply acceptation, you can begin to directionally look at that. So that's very helpful. Thank you.
Yeah, one of the things I liked about the addition of Aporia is that, you know, whenever we talked about disorder or confusion, people like to define themselves in certain ways. And, you know, for me, I come out of the rhetorical tradition where Aporia essentially indicates doubt, which for some people is a much more acceptable framing of their state of mind than confused, let's say, or disordered. And that's, for me, that's a very helpful distinction in that domain where we're trying to figure out where the problem actually lies.
Barbara,
Yeah.
did you hear that? I mean, when we were kind of playing around with Aporia / Confused, the AC, and this is probably serendipity, but we thought that for people that are maybe have an allergic reaction to new language, then you can say one of them is you're aware you're confused, right? Yeah. So the A actually can double as awareness versus aporetic.
Yeah, I remember, you know, hearing that, and that's it. You know, as I say, there's a nice fine distinction in there that really helps make this clearer to people, because they're, you know, I mean, when you're in there, when you're in it, you can't really see it, right? Like that's the idea of that domain, is that you're like, you're in it, so you're up to your eyeballs, and so you're feeling your way around, but there is always, and we've talked about this at this meetup sort of endlessly. Well, I've talked about it at this meetup sort of endlessly. This, you know, this reaction to some of the language, you know, that people don't want to feel labeled, and they don't want to feel, you know, or they use a definition of the terms that we aren't actually necessarily using. And so as we add some of these distinctions to things and give people different ways to look at what we're talking about, I think it will be very helpful in the long run.
I have a question. Oh, go ahead and respond. Go ahead.
No, I was going to add a little fun fact that you know, Aporia actually in the Greek translates to no way through, or in the original text with Aristotle, he said it points to a knot in our thinking. And in a couple of weeks back, we had a master class, and somebody who spoke Greek or who grew up in Greece said that in Greece, students literally raise their hands in class when they don't understand something and say, "Teacher, I have an aporia." So I thought that was really cute. I just wanted to share that.
I have them all the time.
Right. Jaco, just before you go, do we have any Greek speakers on the meetup?
I think we do.
We might. We might.
Yes, I can definitely corroborate that.
Yes, you can.
I have an aporia thing. This is exactly what students do in Greece. You raise your hand and you say, "I have an aporia," which is
awesome.
Aporia.
Oh my God, I'm going to use that all the time in my meetings. Thank you. I'm sorry, Jaco, you had a question. So
yeah, I was dealing with the bombers earlier, so if you address this, please just move along. We oftentimes say, or at least in this discussion group, that if we're looking at the ordered and unordered, which is sort of a separate question that maybe we can get to later on, but we'll oftentimes say that there's pockets of order within the unordered and there's pockets of unordered within the ordered. And then it kind of came up last week when we were discussing it is, can there be pockets of the confused domain within the other domains? And if so, is there any particular way to respond to them based on the other domains? Or is the domain really independent and adjacent to the other domains? Just wondering if there are any thoughts on that.
So when we first introduced this concept of aporia, and we were, you know, starting to really expand on the domain of the confused, we had a lot of practitioners who came to us. They're those who are more sort of, they work more often in the ordered domains, right? So these are people who are potentially delivering massive projects, and they're managing from that level, for example, or operations, for example, where they sometimes go over into complex, but for the most part, their work sits in the ordered domains. And their question to us was, what does this mean for people who mostly practice in the ordered domains? Does this mean that I don't ever sort of encounter aporia? And we thought about it. It's interesting because if you look at, and I think to go back to how the liminal domains are drawn and how the again visually how it actually sits within the framework, you will note that confused actually borders clear, and aporia borders complex and chaos, and to me that's interesting, right? Because it's not that there aren't pockets of it in every domain. I think that if you assume that things are clear and they are not, and you're continuing to function as though they are, it is more likely that you are confused and you're unaware of it. And that's how you potentially fall over the cliff of complacency. But if you acknowledge it, and that's where Michael's point, that A is also about awareness. I'm aware I'm confused. I'm aware that the usual rules don't apply. I'm aware that the situation has shifted and the things that we're doing might not work the same way anymore. That awareness is critical. And that awareness only comes when you actually make that change, right? To say that the situation's not clear. Again, to go back to that domain of clear is where things are so clear that you can sense, categorize, respond, right? That's not the case any longer, right? It could be that there are experts that know how to deal with my situation. And that's why it still sort of borders on complicated. And are you using the right experts, or do the experts need to apply different approaches for your problem, right? Do you need to experiment with it, or do you need to acknowledge they're in chaos and therefore take immediate action to stabilize it? So I think that it's not that there isn't sort of confusion in the clear domain, or when you're in the clear domain, it's more that the awareness is probably not going to be the same. But I know that, again, Chris, you wrote about this. You've also got your hand up. So I don't know if you've got an opinion about this.
I was going to add that this is great conversation, because trying to figure out what confusion is actually the first move. Like that's the point. That's why it's a domain in Cynefin. But I also think that what we just experienced in the Zoom bombing was an example of the two different kinds of confusion. So the people that were coming in with a birthday cake were completely ignorant of what was going on here. They had no idea what was happening. All they did was log on, and it's like, hey, it's your birthday cake, and what the hell is going on? Whereas for Jocko, he has an aporia. Because he's trying to manage the room, and this is very confusing. Like, what's going on? Oh, I think I know what's happening. I think I can take care of this. I'll mute them. Now I got to figure out how to remove them. Now I can remove them. So those are two very different kinds of confusions. And the A confusion, the aporia confusion, is very useful. It's super helpful to be aware and to know you're at a loss. When I was looking up the definition of it back after these original posts, I found the etymology that said at a loss. And to know that you're at a loss is super helpful, because then you can ask for help. But to not know you're at a loss means you just barge into the middle of somebody's meeting with a birthday cake, and you're not even aware you're at a loss. So I just wanted to add that we saw it. That was the best teaching ever, actually. Confusion and aporia.
We're glad we could provide that little live demonstration. It was not expected, but it was interesting.
No, that was my parents, actually.
It was your parents. Excellent. Yeah, I thought I saw the resemblance. I mean, yeah. And
no.
Zhen, you should be honored. As I said, this is our very first Zoom bombing, and it clearly was in your honor. So.
Happy birthday.
Happy birthday. I just want to say that I think that there are a lot of people who are lonely, and they just want to celebrate their birthdays with people. So I'm very glad that we gave them that, and they could take this group photo with us. So
cool.
So I'm not seeing a lot of questions from the floor here.
Barbara, we got Dan has his hand up, and then I wanted
Dan?
to add some
Okay.
thoughts as well.
All right, I didn't realize people were raising their hands. Okay, Dan.
Here.
Dan, you're still muted.
You're
or
muted, Dan.
We can't hear you.
Dan has Texas broadband.
Yeah, you're unmuted, but we can't hear you. So it's on your end, maybe.
Can you turn up your, do you need to turn up your sound or something?
Why don't I'll pose my
Yes,
comment and then let Dan
Cool.
sort his check out. So one of the things, Jocko, you asked, like, there's prior conversations of pockets of confusion in each of the domains, right?
Yep.
And I never thought of it that way before, but it's almost, and then it got me to think about, you know, because we're big on mapping, right? If anyone's done the 4 points, right, linear, whatever, we're always mapping, right? And I started, after you asked the question, I started to think, can you map the confused part of AC, right? And I don't think you can. So because as soon as you actually start to try map it, you become aware of it. So the move is the C domain, to my mind, is the shadow domain, which is actually where the pockets that you think you had that you're not aware of are actually there. They're not necessarily in the other domains, because you have pockets that you have no clue of, right? They're actually in a shadow of C. As soon as you become aware of them through granularity, through sense making and stuff, is you actually shift to A. Now, I don't know how this maps into Dave's, latest dynamics, if it does, but I'm not sure if this type of thinking, because it's kind of like a bit of a dark domain, because as soon as you shine a light on it, it cannot stay in that C domain. I'm not sure if others have thoughts, Zhen or Dan.
It's not ontological.
Yeah, well, confused isn't.
Well, to me, the question is are you looking at Cynefin in general, I guess, as a network or as phase transition thresholds? So are you actually are you going into, are you hitting a phase transition where you're actually entering into another phase, in which case there can still be pockets or bubbles or whatever you want to call them, but the system has shifted. Is the confused domain any different in that sense than perhaps some of the other domains, which might be clearer in the sense of more obvious?
My counter to that is the system is what it is. It's not confused. The people are confused.
Mm-hmm.
That is true, Dan.
What about
I
social
agree with
systems?
Yep.
What about social systems?
Social systems are largely complex. I don't know what to say.
Fair enough.
Yeah, I agree with Dan. I think they and to sort of pick up on Michael's point, is a lot of the work that we do is, again, we know this as complexity practitioners. We cannot offer answers. We can offer perspective. And that's been one of the value of the Cynefin framework, is when you're facilitating people through a mapping exercise, for example, that process has a reflexive, awareness to it. And in the mapping and in the comparing of maps across different perspectives, we don't have to tell them what we're seeing, they see it. So there is this concept of actually that holding the mirror up. And I think that, as Michael has mentioned, is if people say we're confused and we currently don't map AC, we only map sort of the confused domain, right? But I think that if you've done it across groups and you're comparing across teams, and you see different items, whether they're in or out of confused, that also facilitates a conversation that leads to them discovering that they're confused, or whether they need to be confused, or whether, it's, and again, in the past, we used to say that if you're sort of in the confused domain, if your evidence supports so many hypotheses, you don't know which it is, it's actually safer to just say it's complex. And I see that as almost like an entryway into the complex, is to say, hey, we don't know. We don't know what we know. We don't know what we don't know, right? So it might be easier to just say it's complex and experiment. So I sort of see it as facilitating that reflexive awareness.
All right, you mind if I pivot a bit, Zhen?
Of course, go ahead.
For whatever reason, I have this idea and rhetoric of Aporia being feigned confusion. Did you get into that at all with Dave? I'd be curious, like pretending that I'm confused as a tactic of rhetoric.
Yes, absolutely. It's that rhetoric. How do you introduce constructive paradox, and what Babar mentioned earlier, doubt, right? I was reading yesterday about how productive doubt is actually the thing that sits between teaching and learning. So I mean, it's all of those. So absolutely, would love to hear your expansion on that, Dan.
Yeah, well, I think that the piece I'm trying to pull out is feigned doubt. So if you see like a politician that's doing their stump speech and they say, what are we going to do about this problem? What can we possibly do? And of course they have their, 12-step plan or whatnot to back up what they think they should do. I'm just wondering if you had any discussions with Dave on that idea of feigned confusion.
Not in the way you framed it. However, we did talk about how some politicians, let's not name people, but are very good at sort of, I think it's linked to what you're talking about, Dan, is this concept of creating new tropes. Yeah. And introducing, again, that's productive doubt, right? It's what do we do? Or we have this problem and therefore these are my solutions, right? They're trying to, and it's our CEO Sonia sent us this beautiful video yesterday about value selling and how you shouldn't talk about price but about value, right? So it's, again, how do you shift the anchor of the conversation? But yeah, please, I would love to hear more.
Yeah, I don't know that I have a lot more to say, honestly. I'm just wondering if it came up because there's this idea of being maybe humble and acknowledging your own doubt and your own ignorance, which I think is very healthy. But then I think there's this thing in Aporia that's stuck in my brain where it's a bit maybe arrogant or feigned or fake.
Well, I mean, as a rhetorical device, it's often used just to sort of, keep the conversation going. But I think also, Dan, one of the things I see in this is the idea that the example of the politician you gave is that the feigned doubt, the feigned aporia, is often to try to introduce clear solutions to complex problems, right? It's trying to reframe and diminish the complexity of the situation with a clear solution through your feigned doubt. Well, I'm just a simple, blah blah blah, and so this seems super like it. This should work to me, and I think that is the rhetorical device that you're sort of lighting on, and it's a tricky one, but you see it done all the time, right? I mean, how many meetings have we all sat in where we're dealing with what is to us a complex situation, and some bright spark says, well, I don't know about the rest of you, but it seems to me, and they sort of cast doubt on the complexity of the situation in order to bring in a solution from the ordered side.
I think so. I mean, what I did notice, I think that what Dan has pointed out is somebody actually exploiting Aporia. However, what I think I noticed, and maybe other people noticed different things, is during COVID, when things were really bad last year, just about exactly 1 year ago, right? You saw a lot of leaders using Aporia in a very authentic and humble way. It's that they genuinely didn't know, and they had to admit that, and they had to figure it out and admit that we're figuring it out with you. I think that it I'm thinking about tools and technology and all that. It's always agnostic. It's just how it's used, right? But yes, absolutely. I think it can be used one way or the other. But I think a lot of leaders, at least in what we observed a year ago, seem to display genuine, sort of authentic aporia. Yeah, and I mean, invited, I think, more community-driven solutions as well. It's opening up the space, allowing for self-organization to actually occur, I think.
Well, if we bring in now we're bringing intent into the equation. So if we're going to talk about that feigned confusion or whatever, how if we're going to go down this rabbit hole, is where would a liar sit into that? And you could go into all sorts of worse pathology fit into that. I'm not really sure that that's really what Cynefin is attempting to address, is it?
I don't think so. I mean, I think that it can be utilized that way. I see Dan has unmuted. I'd like to hear his response.
Yeah, I think liars, it could be one example of that, but I think there are beneficial versions of that as well. And I kind of like this idea of like exploiting aporia. I think there's something there, Jen. Well, and then this is maybe another kind of exaptive moment, but there's been a lot of people that have been in a cult of one form or another, and their full-time profession now is to help extract individuals from cults and cult-like situations. And so one of the tactics that I heard they use is they try and set up the conditions to have reality kind of impose a discontinuity on the people's perception so that they can realize that for themselves. So how do you purposely create moments of confusion for people? So that sounds like maybe a beneficial use of exploiting aporia. Just an idea.
I think that's I mean, that's the classic innovation move, Dan. Like when you actually have experts that you need to try put a context or condition where they have to relax their desire to lean on their expertise, is you're using some mechanism of shifting the context so you could contradict their expert knowledge that force them to think about the problem space or the solution space differently, or the action space.
I was reading this article. It was on the BBC News maybe a few days ago, and they were talking about the difference in silence, the use of silence between English speakers and non-English speakers. So I thought it was a fascinating article, and they said that in their research, they found that English speakers are the most uncomfortable with periods of silence in a conversation. And whereas if you look at like Japanese speakers in particular use a lot of silence and pauses in between phrases, in between conversations. And to them, it's just a part of the conversation. It's part of the rhythm of the conversation. Whereas when speaking with English speakers, there is this need for them to rush and fill the gaps between, the conversation. And it was really interesting to pick up when Dan said. They said that a lot of Chinese companies have picked up on this discomfort, and they're utilizing and exploiting that to their advantage in negotiations. And a pause is actually a period of silence in a conversation. It's a very micro aporia, I think, is how long are you comfortable holding that silence? And the person who speaks first, right, is giving something away. It's really interesting now that you've brought it to this level, right? It's a micro aporia, I feel. Everyone's silent now. I shouldn't have shared that story.
Yeah, I mean, we had to give it a go, right? You know, I mean, once you threw down the gauntlet, Zhen, what did you expect?
I wasn't going to say anything. See how long that would go on for.
Chris, you're like, you know, you've got Aporia, Euphoria in there. Any thoughts on that?
One question. How do we get people into this? I'm a German. Aporia is a new word for me. I just Googled it, and that's exactly what I'm trying to get people into this mode. And this is kind of a meta problem, because I'm asking for good practices to get them into this, not giving up to the urge to get to a simple solution, but to get to a more abstract perceiving of the overall picture, to get them into this overall view, to accept they are confused. So I'm asking now for good practices. How it's tricky. I'm always struggling with it.
I mean, I can offer maybe one thing. When this new construction of the domains came out, and Zhen, you alluded to this as well, I was super excited about it. I was like, you got me actually interested in that particular aspect of it, in that finally that central domain got some attention. Because I think, and then I realized, that is actually the most important domain. Like, if you don't realize you're starting there, like, none of the other ones really make sense. If you just think everything is clear, you can put all your post-it notes in the clear domain and that's it, and you've used it as a 2x2. So I always start when I'm doing any kind of sense making with putting things in the center and saying, we actually don't know what's going on here, but what if there was a way we could stretch it out? That's a Cynefin contextualization, or which of these problems are solvable, or which are ordered and unordered. And without using any of the terms of the domains, you begin to look at the differences between different kinds of stories or pieces of data that you have. And then things become clearer. And then you can use, you know, my other favorite Cynefin phrase these days is bounded applicability. You can use the right tools for the right problems. But making sure everybody agrees we're all starting in confusion. Because if you're using the Cynefin framework, you're probably confused. Like, nobody uses it if they know what to do. You use it as a decision-making tool. You use it to kind of like help to organize your thinking around the different kinds of approaches. So that's one way you could do it, Kurt, is just draw the diamond to begin with and go, we're going to put everything in the middle. And then you gradually reveal the boundaries by doing like a contextualization would be a really good exercise for that. And I've done that. That seems to work.
The other thing is concentrate like-minded thought pattern thinkers, right? Maximize group think and get them working on the same task, completely independent. So it might be creating a Cynefin framework with exactly the same data set, right? And then what you're going to do is the contrasts of where they differ, the outputs differ, is you actually are going to put them back into that aware that they're confused, because they're looking at the same situation completely differently, right? And that's a fundamental sort of pattern of our assemblies of workshop methods, is how do you illuminate contrasts? Otherwise, we use language in a very abstract way into a bland sort of false sense of consensus that we are all talking the same thing, but you don't know, right? And you know, that's where confused is lurking in the shadows, right? Because it's in our assumptions that we think we agree and we see this problem space or whatever the solution space the same way in the context.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, makes sense. Sense making.
Speaking of sense making, so let's talk, Zhen, if you wouldn't mind giving us a sort of brief rundown around where the sense making software is right now, but like, you know, how the approach to sense making has evolved as well over the last couple of years, you know, as it keeps pace with how the framework has changed.
Are you, I'm sorry, just to clarify my understanding, Barbara, you're talking about the SenseMaker tool, right? Not sense making as an approach.
Well, either one or both, but certainly Are you frozen? Oh, there you are. Now you're frozen again. But anyway, I was thinking that it could be either or both if you're so inclined. But certainly, I think that as we change, just what Chris was just talking about having everyone start in the middle, some of the approaches we're taking to sense making in general are changing as the framework evolves.
Yeah.
And I was wondering if how you, Dave, and the other smarties are all thinking about this as you move forward with these changes.
Okay, so maybe I'll try to blend the response. There is a simple response and then there's a difficult one, which is why I asked the question.
It's early, you can keep it simple.
So I think that in particular, what has happened over the past year has made uncertainty a fact of everyone's life. And it's not that it wasn't before, but it's a pronounced fact now and people can't ignore it. So that has increased sort of awareness and interest in Cynefin and the need for sense making rather than analysis. So we ran a study toward the end of 2020. It's called Complex Trends 2021, and it was run on SenseMaker, which is again the sense making tool where we collect narrative input together with quantitative metadata. So some of the insights that we got from that tool were super interesting, and it's something I can share the report with the group. So Barbara and Jocko, I'll send you the report after this call. Bao has seen it. Bao was on our call a couple of weeks ago. I know some of you were also on that call to review the results together, but I'll send that over so everyone can take a look at it. But one of the most pronounced trends that came from that is that we asked people, what are some of the changes that you've noticed in 2020 in your line of work, in your industry, or in your organization? And then also looking forward to 2021, what are some of the key challenges or decisions that you have to make or you expect that need to be made? And then, of course, we asked them a series of signifiers. So for those of you who aren't aware, SenseMaker uses geometric shapes, and we're famous for triads. So the triads are designed in such a way that the labels on the triads are always balanced. So they're either all neutral, all positive, all negative, for example. The reason why we do this is we found that the traditional approach of using sort of Likert scales going from positive to negative means that particularly with survey fatigue, people just quickly circle off and finish it. And also in traditional surveys, these tend to be divorced from the qualitative aspect, right? So you're just getting an opinion-based question. So there's no way to triangulate it with qualitative data. SenseMaker sort of brings the two together. So our signifiers ask them to describe what they've shared in terms of that key decision. And one of the questions that we asked was, thinking about this decision or challenge, right? What are some of the investment or changes that need to be made? What are you going to rely on to make some of these changes? And the question, and for those of you who are working in consulting, might make you panic a bit, but we asked whether it was data analysis, internal sort of sense-making capability, or sort of expert advice. And it all sort of trended toward internal learning experimentation balanced with data and analysis. None on the expert. So very, very few. So that was one of the trends that we got. And that to us signifies that people are recognizing the importance of sense making, but some degree of data-informed sense making, right? And internal experimentation. So for us, that means that sense making needs to be a lot more accessible. So what we've been working on now, I don't know if some of you might be involved. Dave has just released this EU field guide with the European Union. And it's about, what are the steps you have to take to manage in crisis, for example. And with the release of that, Dave has also created a wiki, which open sources a lot of our methods. So in terms of methods being available to people, that's one of the ways that we're actually making it accessible so everybody can access, understand how to utilize some of these methods. In parallel, we're going to be releasing method cards. So the cards are going to be like hexes, how do you put an assembly together? You can actually assemble the cards. And the method cards will tell you exactly what you need to do, how you need to, sort of approach this. So it's really like a how-to deck of method cards. In parallel as well, SenseMaker as a tool is going to become a lot more accessible. One of the ways that we've talked about it in reference to the field guide is we've got this approach called MESS sense, which is essentially utilizing SenseMaker, but it's situational assessment. So we present a situation, or we represent an aporia of situations, really different perspective, things, situations that actually pull at the edge of each other, right? There is tension and contrast between different perspectives, and to get people to generate hypotheses. So one of the ways that we're using it is to actually do hypothesis generation, because in a crisis situation, for example, there isn't really time to deliberate so much. You need to generate multiple viable hypotheses to actually then say, these are the ones we can try, and how are we going to do it? So those are some of the, again, I'm skipping over a whole bunch of things. And I'm going to ask Michael if he has anything to add later on. But those are some of the moves that we are making. So we have been working really hard behind the scenes to make SenseMaker as a tool really accessible to everybody. We are, fingers crossed, a week away from doing a bit of a small launch where we're going to give away like free accounts to trial and demonstrate the tool for the next period of time. So those are some of the things that we've been busy with. I don't know if it answers exactly your question, Barbara, but I want to get Michael to maybe chime in a little bit, because I might have missed some things out.
Okay, well, Michael, before you start, I just want to point out to everyone that Chris has dropped a link to the field guide into the chat. So if you want a copy of it, grab it up now, because that will save Jocko and I having to do emailing later. Go ahead, Michael, sorry.
No, I think, but coming back to your question around sense making, right? And if I understood it correctly, Barbara, you were asking how the latest developments in the framework, how has that impacted, what we're doing around sense making, and then also how does our tool SenseMaker affect that? I think that the reason that we've moved fast to open source on the wiki and get that moving really fast is the current context has made sense making absolutely critical, and capacity for people to make sense in their environment rather than outsourcing, right, expert knowledge on guiding, right? So I think there's a lot to be said about, the whole conversation we had on Aporia and Confused, right, as actually facilitating people's awareness of how do we actually move to a greater awareness of our confusion, but more importantly, awareness of how we can look at our context, our environment in the different contexts or the different ontological domains, and then move to action. And that's really where the field guide actually comes prominent. Is the field guide is probably Dave's strongest, most detailed synthesis of how the latest developments of the framework are, the implications of that to sense making, particularly in a crisis, but perhaps easily accessible to any confused state. And then I think one of the more exciting aspects of where we're taking SenseMaker, the tool, is how we actually, it's a subtle, it's less on the surface of the tool, but it's more how easily it is going to be to share sense making across different groups. So that linking and connecting of, we have an engaged population, an employee group, sample of the population, citizens of a region, a country, customer base. Once you become aware and you get more eyes on the sense making, how do you facilitate that awareness more widely in a networked way? And I think what we're starting off with what Jen's been working on, and she just mentioned within a week or two of launching initially to our premium network group, that access is the exciting one, is how the networking effect is going to create emergent capability, and we're not even fully aware of that potential there, right? So that's where I think the tool is making some advances, and we had to get to this sort of single sign-on, and it took us probably a year and a half, Jen, to really fully refactor in many ways and evolve in the context of a bunch of other things that we had occupying us. But that's I think I covered that reasonably completely from my perspective.
Michael, it's amazing. You just came to Lurk and we put you to work. And,
yeah.
and to the group, Michael will be our guest on April 13th to share with us his thoughts on psychological safety in organizations. So look out for that as well. But, Michael, thank you so much, because, I know you just came to listen, and now we're making you do all of this work.
I couldn't leave Jen start at 6, especially since we kept her up to midnight, I think, last night in another meeting.
You're like you're a warrior here. I mean, I'm like, I wouldn't get up to at 6 o'clock in the morning to talk to anybody, much less a meetup of us.
No, and that's why I was like, I hope I'm coherent today, this morning before my coffee.
Well, Jocko, anything? I mean, we're approaching the amount of time that we told Jen we would take up, and so Jocko, do you have any final thoughts you want to get in?
I do not, but I've been up since 5 a.m. as well. So my brain is key, but I did want to see if anybody in had a quick question or something. Anybody want to throw anything out there before we wrap up?
Because some of you have been putting stuff in the chat, but they weren't really questions, so I didn't quite know how you wanted me to frame those. So
just a quick one. Sorry, I put the complex trends report in the chat already, so you can download it off of that. Yeah.
Yep, I got it.
Thank you.
Cool.
See, you come for the presentation, you get all this stuff. Okay, well.
I love the part of the silence now. So that's kind of the one thing about now that we're all in Zoom and everybody's super conscious, but it is actually a technique that you can use to hold that space of silence. So, and it's very, very powerful because it affects everybody.
I hope you're happy, Jen. I see.
How do you weaponize? Yeah, how do you weaponize silence? It's some passive aggressive black belt.
Kind of is, yeah.
Well, I think you've created a monster, and I hope you're happy. I mean, I see how this is going to go, and I'm a little afraid. But on that note, if there are no further questions, any of my usual suspects, Shrikant, Bernie, Richard, you've been busy in the chat. Do you have anything you want to add to anything so far before we wrap this up?
No, I just want to thank you all for allowing me to be part. I'm coming in from Honolulu, Hawaii, and so sort of halfway between New York and Singapore. So I'm as we like to say in Honolulu, we're sort of the bridge between East and West. And so I just appreciate you opening this up. And I was consciously not Zoom bombing because I heard there was cake, and so but I just thanks for hosting this, and I look forward to future participation activities.
Yeah, Richard, and shoot me an email because I hail from Hawaii as well, and I would like to chat about Hawaii with you if you're ever interested. This is Jocko.
Jocko, I would love it. And there's one other Cynefin sort of thinking person that's out here, and I have been working desperately to try and get folks to think more in this space, which lends itself to the indigenous ways of knowing and thinking out here. So I think it's ripe out here.
That's right. Hawaii is its own domain, I would say.
It really is.
Richard, if you're interested, I know somebody who used to work at the East West Center in Hawaii, and I know that he's got some Cynefin interested in Cynefin trained folks. So if you're interested, I can put you guys in touch as well.
Oh, that would be fantastic. Thanks, Jen.
No problem.
Okay, the New York City Complexity and Cynefin meetup is now part cake, part travelogue. I got it all going on here. This has been great.
This is very New York, Barbara. I just have to say, this is so New York.
We weren't actually shooting for that, but we'll take it. Zhen, I mean, unless anyone else has any questions, I think we should release Zhen to either a nap or breakfast. I can't thank you enough for coming by. This has been so awesome. You are, as always, one of our heroes. And thank you also to Chris and Michael and Daniel for weighing in at will. We appreciate your contributions. I hope you all have enjoyed the conversation as much as I have. Jocko, anything
Barbara,
to say? Yes?
just one thing. Thanos, are you wanting a question? I thought I saw a raised hand.
Somebody raise a hand? Okay. Thanos is actually sideways in my
I know, mine too.
I can't really see. There you go.
I thought I saw a raised hand.
Yeah, it was actually, it's something I would like to ask Zhen regarding about the SenseMaker.
Okay.
I've been working in the pharmaceutical industry for some time. So one of the contexts where questionnaires are mostly used are in clinical trials about drugs that relate to mental health, which is not there is not something you can measure, some kind of biomarker or whatever. Well, there are things, but we cannot actually define any clinical trial outcome by those markers. So they all depend on questionnaires. But this needs to be totally quantitative in order to measure something and to approve something over another drug that is currently circulating. So I briefly discussed this with Dave in one of the sessions of the wiki. Are you aware of someone having done any work on that I could contact, or do you think that it's even possible to use SenseMaker for that?
I absolutely think so. I mean, Bao, who is on this call, and his wife Riva and I are working together on potentially utilizing it for diabetes type 1 patients. As a lot of what we know as healthcare is actually not really healthcare in the way it should be. So a lot of it is self-management. Particularly for conditions like type 1 or for mental health. If you're aware, a lot of it is self-management. So I think on that level, it's absolutely applicable. It's not going to replace your measurement tools, but it will augment. Because one of the things we found is so many things with these medications and is that a lot of the variations show up in lifestyle, and a lot of the things that get ignored in a purely quantitative approach tend to show up anecdotally. So SenseMaker is a really good way to capture those outliers or those weak signals that are anecdotal and to actually give you more context-based information, because one of the things that we talk about with SenseMaker is it's not just about content, it's not just about measurement, it's also about the context. So yes, these people of the same age, background, and all that are taking this medication, but why is it working for some and not working for others, or working differently? A lot of it is influenced by context. And how do we actually surface those contextual things so there is awareness of them? I don't know, Bao, if you want to say something.
No, you said it all. The addition of context, I would imagine, in the pharmaceutical industry, would be very important. So it would be augment. It would really enrich the data set. So it's not that you would eliminate the quantitative data, you would enrich it. And so, yeah, I totally agree with what Shen said.
Yeah. Thanos, again, I think you have my email address. Feel free to reach out and we can have another conversation. There's a lot of work now, for example, being done in the area of trying to understand how, health burnout is being handled, for example, in healthcare and things like that, which, I mean, a lot of it is mental health, might not necessarily have the pharmaceutical aspect, but I think that there's a lot of points we can leverage.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
We will be in contact. Okay. I'll try to reach you. Thank you.
All right, I think we've reached Barbara's bedtime, which is when we always like to close the show at 7:30. But once again, I want to reiterate exactly what Barbara said. Thank you so much. This has been fantastic. And thanks for everybody for piping in as well. And we hope to see you in how many more weeks is that, Michael? 3 more weeks?
I think it's like 2.
It's a blur.
Yeah.
But we'll all be getting together again. So.
I mean, at this point, does time really have any meaning for any of us at all under any circumstances? It's just like, whatever. Again, thank you so much, everyone. We'll see you soon. Look out. Please come back on April 13th to hear Michael, have a full 90 minutes to himself. And we appreciate all of you so much. And there will not be cake.
Thank you, everyone. Thanks for having me, Barbara and Jaco.
Thank you so much. Bye. Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.